In 2013, Robert McDaniel, a 22-year-old black man living in Chicago, got an unexpected visit from a police commander. McDaniel had no violent criminal history or any recent contact with law enforcement. Still, he was told by the commander that the police were keeping an eye on him. Although McDaniel had no way of knowing it, he had been placed on the department's heat list, a list of Chicagoans generated by a computer algorithm who police deemed were likely to be involved in violent crime. The aim? To try and stop crime before it even happens. It's called predictive policing. Proponents say it's a legitimate use of data that helps modernize the way police work. Companies that sold predictive policing tools and the departments that adopted them said they would help police make sensible, data-driven decisions. By taking human bias out of the equation and relying on math and computers for decision-making, law enforcement would become more efficient and more fair. But predictive policing also raises questions. How efficient was this technology? Did it perpetuate racial bias by encouraging police to target men like McDaniel? As protests against racism and police brutality continue to sweep across the world, that question has come under the spotlight. Predicting crime may sound like the setting for a sci-fi movie, but the idea has been around for a long time. In the 19th century, police relied on rudimentary maps to track criminal behavior. In the modern era, police departments began collecting more sophisticated data. The NYPD's CompStat program in the 1990s aimed to create a citywide database of crime patterns. It wasn't until the last decade that US police departments started using computer models to predict crime, ushering in the era of predictive policing.
I think the original sort of push came from this sense that technology could solve problems. If you think about the recession in 2008, 2009, police departments were gutted. They lost funding, they lost the ability to hire new officers. So technology offered police the ability to do more with less.
So how does it actually work?
So most predictive policing models are attempting to use historical police data to predict where a crime may occur or who may commit a crime. So that way, police departments can more strategically patrol those areas, all under the logic that this would help reduce crime.
It was a bold innovation. In fact, in 2011, Time magazine listed the California predictive policing platform Predpol as one of the 50 best inventions of the year.
The primary driver of predictive policing in the early years was the media. The number of headlines with like Minority Report policing that were written is, the thing that was pushing other departments to get interested in the next new thing and not want to be left out. And then you had in 2014, the first revolt against policing and police tactics after Ferguson. Data allowed police to say, don't worry, we realize there may be a problem here, but we're moving toward a more quote-unquote objective data-driven policing strategy.
This increase in demand led a number of companies to develop their own predictive policing software to sell to police across the world, from Denmark to Israel. As predictive policing spread, the technology became more sophisticated. Initially, the focus was on predicting where a crime would take place, but it later moved on to predict who was likely to commit violent crimes.
The idea was that by looking at particular risk factors in an individual's background, police could identify them as a risk for violence in the future.
And then it evolved again.
And then the third iteration was really this idea, well, if it worked with places and people, maybe it can work with groups. So you start seeing the social network analysis being built into these systems where groups are becoming the at-risk groups.
From New York's CompStat to Philadelphia's Hunch Lab and Chicago's Trap, predictive services offered by tech companies have boomed over the last decade across the US. So does the technology actually work? In 2011, the local police department in Santa Cruz, California, rolled out the predictive policing software Predpol. The initial results were promising, with the company reporting a 19% drop in burglaries in the first year and a 25% fall in Los Angeles. But some researchers weren't convinced.
Often police departments are executing many different types of reforms at the same time, so it's very difficult to suggest that any drop or fluctuation in a crime rate is attributable to any one technology or any one specific practice by a police department.
Did predictive policing risk undermining the rule of law and eroding human rights?
If a police officer is told to go patrol a particular block at a particular time for a particular crime, it means that individuals who happen to be walking that block at that time are essentially walking through an area that has lesser Fourth Amendment protections than somewhere else, all because of an algorithm that we don't know if it works or not.
Questions have been raised about the transparency around these models, how they're built, and how departments use their data.
One of the major problems with predictive policing is that it relies on what we call dirty data. And this is data produced by police departments and other external data. What happens when this type of data is ingested into a predictive policing technology is that it leads to what is known as a confirmation feedback loop, and that it's going to continue to send police officers to the same areas they patrol or to target the same people they previously targeted because that's what the data is showing. And this becomes a problem because it means that communities and individuals that have been subject to more scrutiny than necessary will continue to be subjected to more scrutiny than is necessary.
So where does racial bias come into this? While the system behind predictive policing technology is colorblind, locations and cities can give an indication of race, with poor neighborhoods often populated by minority groups and wealthier areas by white people. Predpol says on its website, Predpol does not collect, upload, analyze, or in any way involve any information about individuals or populations and their characteristics. While the system can impact people who happen to be in a targeted area, researchers say the danger is greater when the software highlights specific individuals, like in the case of Robert McDaniel, who found himself in Chicago's heat list.
The inputs to make the Chicago heat list involved arrests for things like narcotics offenses or assaults. They involved whether you, the individual, had been the victim of assault. So you might make this list just because you were getting hurt a lot, not because you were actually the offender. And so using inputs in which are going to be racially biased, you're going to create outputs that are racially biased. And when they audited the Chicago heat list, the strategic subjects list, they found exactly that. The vast majority of the people on the list to be young men, usually black and brown, and always poor.
After a decade of growth, some cities are now reevaluating their relationship with predictive policing. The program in Chicago was shut down in 2020 after being criticized by activists and civil liberties groups. The city's own inspector general called the risk scores it generated unreliable. In New Orleans, the software developed by tech company Palantir was dropped in 2018 after being used for 6 years without the knowledge of the public. But while some cities have stopped using these algorithms, Santa Cruz, which was once a model example of predictive policing, has gone one step further and banned it.
I remember back when I was living in Santa Cruz when predictive policing was first launched, people were comparing it to the movie Minority Report, and as a citizen, it scared me. I think here in Santa Cruz, one of the factors is that we had two different police chiefs, one who was a strong proponent of it, and then when we had our new police chief come in, he looked at it and saw like, it really actually isn't effective. But we brought the item to council. Overwhelmingly, the people who came out were saying that it makes sense at this point in time that we ban it. If we're going to use these kinds of technologies, we need to be using them to answer questions around what needs to be done better within these communities to help uplift them and ensure that, by reducing people being in poverty, we're seeing lower crime. Not that by putting more police in these communities, we're arresting more people.
Following the death of George Floyd in police custody, calls have been rising in the U.S. to reform and even defund police forces. So what does the future look like for predictive policing? And does an alternative exist?
I think a common misunderstanding about predictive policing is that it is actually predicting crime and can help inform better police practices. But the reality is the name is quite accurate. It's predicting policing. It's more likely to predict what the police are already doing and not say much about the communities that they're engaged with.
What if you separate out the risk identification that we use for predictive policing, not to identify places of crime, but the risk factors in the community that are causing these crimes? And what if instead of responding with a policing remedy, a police officer at your door, a police car in your neighborhood, you responded by sort of building up the neighborhood that's causing that sort of environmental vulnerability that's increasing risk?
I'll tell you, here in Santa Cruz, 80% of our calls for service are for mental or behavioral health. So do we need to continue having officers go out who aren't trained, I should say, as mental health officers?
This is a larger problem of technological solutionism that is rampant in the tech industry, and believing that technology can solve all of our problems rather than starting with a question of what do we need to have a fair and equitable society and what is the role of technology, if any.